Ukraine needs a game changer. In fact, it needs two, argue Jon Sweet and Mark Toth in their latest article in The Hill. The first is Washington's unequivocal green light to use US-made weapons and other Western equipment to strike Russian troops staging along its borders, especially those near the Kharkiv Oblast. Russia is using this US restriction as a way to plan and execute attacks against civilians and to launch new offensives. Secondly, Kyiv needs a no-fly zone and fast. Welcome to Silicon Curtain. Please like and subscribe to help new people find our incredible speakers who so generously give their time up to speak on the channel. If you enjoyed the content, please also add a comment. It really is incredibly helpful to drive the videos in the algorithm to a new audience. Please also consider becoming a patron, buy me a coffee. Before you do that, check out the validated Ukrainian charities that appear in the description of the video. We have to help Ukraine remain resilient, and we have learnt that donations to all sorts of charities in Ukraine have dropped off a cliff in the last couple of months, along with media coverage. So it's especially important now to help Ukraine remain resilient. Jon Sweet is an accomplished intelligence professional who served for 30 years within the defense and intelligence sector as a US Army military intelligence officer. He is now a freelance author, contributor, and columnist for The Hill, The Messenger, Washington Examiner, Kyiv Post, and Fox News. He provides an experienced military perspective on current world events. Mark Toth is a retired economist, historian, and entrepreneur and has lived in US diplomatic and military communities around the world. Mark writes on issues of national security and foreign policy and is a regular contributor to The Hill, BBC, Washington Examiner, Fox News, Kyiv Post, and The Messenger. And I should say, this is the second time they've been on the channel. So if you enjoyed this video, do please go back and check our original interview. But gentlemen, I'm delighted to welcome you back.
Hey, thanks for having us back on, Jonathan. Appreciate it.
And you have been extremely prolific in writing some fantastic articles that are helping to move the debate forward, edge it towards a concept of victory for Ukraine. The challenge is, though, isn't it, that there still isn't a clear concept of endgame. There still isn't a clear concept of what winning means in Ukraine, and the supply of munitions, training, etc., is not commensurate to any kind of full victory.
Yeah, absolutely. What we don't see is a winning strategy. We haven't heard a winning strategy presented either by the United States or by NATO. What we have seen is weapons going into the country, humanitarian assistance going into the country, training for the military force, but we're not seeing an end state. The word win has been used, but the strategy isn't supporting win. The strategy is support and defend. And that's what's frustrating because, as you just mentioned, Russian forces are massing on one side of the border. They're firing artillery from that side of the border into Kharkiv, the Oblast, into other areas of the country. And while Ukraine has the ability to strike back, they're limited because of the munitions and the restrictions that are placed upon them by both the United States, but also by NATO partners. So it's one thing to say win, it's another thing to enable win. The weapons are fantastic. The Ukrainians are using them beyond the capabilities I think that many analysts thought they would be able to. And in the case of air defense, an absolute necessity. But if your strategy is to merely shoot missiles out of the sky, then they're going to continue to shoot missiles. If your strategy is to win, you will eliminate the weapon platform where it is so it can't fire additional missiles at you. So that's why we say actions don't match words. So Ukraine needs deeds. They don't need any more words.
Yeah, Jonathan, I'd add one thing to what John is saying here. I think we're not just seeing it as a lack of a winning strategy. We're starting to see the actions coming out of the White House and Brussels is starting to formulate a losing strategy. Ukraine cannot sustain itself along these lines. There has to be these game changers. And because of the delay, partly caused by funding, but partly caused as well by the lack of capabilities given to Ukraine, such as the long-range ATACMS, et cetera, the Taurus missile that Olaf Scholz still won't give Ukraine. we're seeing the need for these game changers, and they're going to have to be big ones. And the no-fly zone is one way of doing that. If we don't go there, I can see where this starts to turn south. And so I know a lot of people call us hawks in that regard. I'd argue John and I are not hawks. We're realists, and we're starting to see problems develop on the battlefield that, if unchecked and if not addressed, are going to lead to reversals. And we need to mitigate that and have a plan to overcome that.
But we'll talk in a minute about how Russia is retooling its society, its economy and politics towards total war. But let's continue on this theme just for a minute. What are we asking Ukraine to do? We're asking them to defend themselves, but essentially tie one hand behind their back. In your most recent article, you've made the case that if similar restrictions were placed on the British during World War II, then essentially we'd all be speaking German by now.
Exactly. You know, I can start with that. Having lived in London, it would be like going through the Battle of Britain, and you could let the German, Messerschmitts come over, the Henkel bombers bomb, and yet you do nothing. You could shoot them down as long as they're over your country. But God forbid, if Churchill was, not allowed by Roosevelt at the time in terms of Lend-Lease, et cetera, of using those American supplied weapons to go take out their bases that were along the French coastline at that point. So it's madness. I mean, you've hit it on the head.
And let's turn then to why this is also a losing strategy, because the idea of an attritional war presumes that at some point the price will become too high for Russia. We know that the price at some point will be too high for Ukraine because Ukraine has a sort of humanitarian sense towards its citizens and its troops. There will be a line which they can no longer expend people and resources. Russia does not seem to have those limits. That idea has not really cut through. By placing these limitations, is there still the assumption that some kind of negotiated solution with Russia is possible? An assumption that Russia will at some point have had enough?
I think the assumption exists, but I don't think in actuality Russia's in a position or even wants to be in a position for a negotiated settlement. And even if there is a negotiated settlement, please tell me the last negotiated settlement that Russia's honored. It's a fallacy, I think, in thought to even consider that Russia would live up to any negotiated settlement, especially with Putin at the helm. This latest reshuffling of the cabinet by putting in the new Minister of Defense it's messaging to the West and to Ukraine that we're prepared to go at this for a long time. We're going to put our country in an economic footing to last, and I think that's also an escalation threat. They're escalating to do a protracted war, and they know that Western countries who are, as you earlier said, in the process of elections and campaigns, don't want to run on a protracted war. So they're playing to that. It's not a fear, but they're playing to that objective as well. Mark?
Yeah, I'd add to that. John's exactly right. I'd add to that in terms of negotiations, I don't see that happening. And especially because right now, I think if you look at everything that they are messaging to the West, Putin senses blood in the water. Doesn't necessarily mean blood on the battlefield, but he senses that Washington and Brussels collectively are not willing to take the measures needed to defeat him in Ukraine. And so we're seeing a lot of, bravado, instance taking out the buoys and what is it, the Narna River there dividing Estonia from Russia, declaring that, it's now their territorial water, which once was Finland's in and around Kaliningrad and the like. And so, from that standpoint, Putin's not ready for negotiations. Putin is trying to kind of play in a way, a poker bluff. And right now, I think many in the West are buying it. And that's unfortunate. So in that regard, I think what we're looking at here is the West are the ones necessarily wanting to see negotiations come about. But Putin and even Iran, for instance, just as an aside, they've learned how to play the US with those kinds of negotiation offers. I think we need to be very wary of falling for them because they're not real. They'll take you down paths that just are going to dead end on you.
And this is a really interesting point that you just made there about the purge that is taking place, or the reshuffle, to put it mildly. It seems, or it's taking on the character more of a purge at this point. So you've got someone who knows literally nothing about the military whatsoever being appointed as the Minister of Defense. That potentially talks to the idea of retooling the economy for, as you say, the long haul. And potentially a lot more businesses being nationalized, converted into war munitions capacity, as well as trying to drive out some of the more excessive corruption and price gouging from the system. You're also seeing in the last couple of days, now this is very fresh and there are multiple interpretations, but you're seeing all sorts of military figures being arrested. One recently, Popov, an extremely popular general, one of the few generals, it is apparently said that he wasn't massively on the take, which is the exception rather than the rule in Russia, that he's the one who's ended up in jail. Today we hear that one of the key lieutenants of Gerasimov is going down as well. This appears now to be more a systemic kind of purge, taking on almost Stalinist characteristics. What do you think is going on?
Let me take that first, and then I'll defer to John on the military side of it. As an economist or trained economist, I think what you're seeing here is that Putin recognizes that his economy is not firing on all cylinders when it comes to changing it, converting it into a war economy. And so from that standpoint, bringing in economists, you can make those decisions, because it's one thing for everyone to say, hey, we need X piece to show up on the battlefield. Someone has to figure out the competing demands for that. Who gets the natural resources to make that happen? Who gets the labor and the talent that can design, implement, and produce it? Who gets the logistics side, the delivery, the trucks, the trains that deliver it. So all of that, it creates a bottleneck and can tie it up. So those kind of czars, which we saw during World War II, are important. And I think that's telling us a couple of things about Putin. He recognizes to date that what's happened to him in Ukraine is in large part because of the grift, the stealing, and everything else that's gone on inside of the defense ministry and needs to change. But he also recognizes he's bit off more than he can chew. This has become a bigger economic issue for him that's going to require him to truly take his entire economy to a war footing. And he's well along that way. And so I think that's why you're seeing these changes. Now, in terms of how that may impact the battlefield, obviously some of these generals are going, and they're going because they're incompetent. And that may or may not help. John can speak much better to that in terms of what may show up on the battlefield. The risk I see as a non-military person is you might get a better general now.
So I'll add a few comments on the purge aspect of the discussion. From my perspective, this is as the Kinks would sing, it's just paranoia. There was a lot of discussion, obviously, when Prigogine was making his move north towards Moscow, that there was a coup that was in process, and there was an investigation that was launched, and some people were removed from office. But I suspect that a deeper investigation may have identified other people that either supported it directly or turned a cheek when they knew something was up, and that may or may not have contributed to the current purge that's going on. As far as the wartime footing and the economics piece, I think Putin has, in some cases, experienced some humiliation on the world front by having to turn to North Korea for munitions. Particularly 155 munitions for his artillery and 122 munitions, but he's also had to turn to Iran for drones that he's using right now in Ukraine to target Ukrainian civilians. So there's a bit of humiliation there too. But let's also understand he can retool, and he can mobilize, and he can do a lot of things, and he can commit more troops to the fight. But what he's committing to the fight aren't seasoned veterans. He's committing to the fight mobilized reservists and conscripts. You're seeing not talent on the battlefield, rather you're seeing 18-year-old and 6-year-old men given uniforms, placed on trains with not much training, and being thrown into the fight under the assumption that I have more people that you have ammunition or will to fight them. So it's a dual-edged sword. I think he's showing himself in two areas, and those areas that we could exploit, but we're simply not doing that right
This is a really, sorry.
If I may real quickly here, I think John's exactly right on the paranoia. I think that's, certainly a driving force. So I just want to make sure that, in me assessing it more from an economic standpoint, that we don't lose sight that Russia is a mafia state, and that what you are seeing is that kind of mafia paranoia. And spot on, John.
now.
I was going to dig into that actually, because I think this is a fascinating question, and this is going to be tremendously important, I think, to Ukraine, which way Russia goes. If the purge is to root out corruption and try to promote competent people, that of course is bad news. But all the evidence seems to be pointing in the other way, which is the number one priority for Putin is loyalty and security for himself. So Belousov is he's essentially command economy, Gosplan apparatchik, not necessarily the most competent person to hand in the current situation, but Putin is assured of his loyalty, and also he's assured that this character is not somebody who will outshine him and become a potential rival. So if this is the case and decisions are being made on who to imprison or who not, based on loyalty rather than competence, could this actually be very good for Ukraine?
In the short term, marginal. In the long term, if it becomes protracted, absolutely, it could work to their favor. Again, in this case, competence is the casualty of loyalty, right? So, yeah, you cutting the people out, your military professionals. We've seen this before in the Second World War, right? In which Germany got rid of a lot of its competent leaders too, because one man thought he could lead the army more successfully than his established generals. So you're seeing a little bit of that. Surrounding yourself with yes men, history has proven, is not a good technique. You need somebody that can tell you this isn't going to work. You should consider X, Y, or Z. But by removing the competent professionals and putting in people who will just tell you what you want to hear, in the long term, I think that's a losing proposition for Putin.
Yeah, I'd add two quick things there. I think it's important to look at Belousov as Putin going after a bigger piece of the pie here, not just in Ukraine. I think sometimes we get hyper focused on Ukraine, but I think this reorientation of his economy into a war footing is one that's designed to regain his superpower status. He's been humiliated for the past several years, and he wants to lean forward into that. The other, with respect to Belousov coming into power, is simply saying we can't continue along this path that we've been on. The grift, the stealing, and I know there may be a bit difference between how we as Americans use the word grift and we mean stealing, siphoning off, than your British audience. That's got to stop. And I think the jury's still out on that. It's just too soon to know whether he'll be competent or not. Clearly, Putin is looking for his Albert Speer. And I'd remind people, a lot of people forget that in World War II, Germany's war production was actually at its highest in the last quarter of the first quarter of 1945, the last quarter that they fought. So I would be wary of just dismissing this move until we see the results of it. It could be dramatic and it could be problematic in the long term.
And I think the interesting thing, isn't it, as well, is that we're now in the third year of war. By escalation management, by seeking to try and control risk, it has drawn the conflict out, whereas it potentially could have come to a conclusion, or Ukraine could be in a far better position at this point, especially without the ammunition famine. The theory is that this attritional behavior should weaken your adversary, but there are signs that Russia is more belligerent, more aggressive, more toxic, and has actually been quite capable at rebuilding the ranks of its army that was decimated in the initial siege of Kyiv.
Oh, absolutely. And I think it comes down to Russian mentality, at least the mentality that they've exhibited, since the First World War. It's just that accepting loss is not is not within their DNA. It's just more, try harder. It's as General Hodges would say, this is all about mass. They can mass artillery, and they can mass people, and they can throw that at you. And at the same time, they're still able to deliver ballistic missiles and drones and bombs from their fighter aircraft. But at the end of the day, this is about mass. This is simply about overwhelming you. In a football sense, American football sense, this is 3 yards in a cloud of dust. How are you going to stop me? And the way to stop that, at least from my perspective, is through interdiction. You have to interdict these forces before they arrive on the battlefield. Once they're in the close fight, it's too late. You have to defeat them on the Russian side of the battle. And when they show themselves, I mean, we're talking 30 to 70,000 forces that are estimated to participate in the initial attack on Kharkiv. It's that could have been attrited because they're in the similar areas and they're massing and they present themselves as targets. And even Ukraine has said they've seen it, but they prohibited from hitting it. So it's just from my perspective, when I see that, I know that 30 years in the service, we would never fight that way. We would never enable someone to strike us from that strength when we had the means to stop it. So interdiction, and that's a key word. Interdiction is the key to slowing this down and winning the war. But you have to create space between the close fight and the deep fight. And right now there is no space because it's perpetual. It comes at them every day in the same strength. And they're killing 1,000 a day, Jonathan. But that's not stopping the flow. You got to stop the flow. Mark?
Yeah, I agree with John. I would add also that this is about mass, I mean, from the Russian perspective, but it's also a willingness to kill and target civilians. And we're seeing that in, on a large scale daily in Ukraine. And so until Washington, until Biden says to enough's enough. I mean, they are weaponizing humanity, they being Putin, is weaponizing humanity. And it's causing Ukraine to hold things back. There's air defense systems that could be pushed to the front, but instead they need to attack their people. Ukraine's not killing Russian population or civilian populations. So the willingness of Russia to fight that fight is another element that the West has yet to really come to terms with. And I think, more than anything, that's why John and I today said enough's enough in the Hill. It's time for a no-fly zone so that Ukraine can push those assets forward to the battlefield, and we can put a stop to this senseless murder of civilians in Kyiv, Odessa. And for me, that tipping point, just personally, when you arrive at that, we're seeing cluster munitions used in Odessa. The woman laying beside her dog that's dead. I mean, it's just ridiculous. I mean, if that happened in downtown London or in Washington, D.C. or New York, we'd be saying, hell no, enough is enough.
Well, I mean, given the intensity of that, and I remember seeing those pictures, I mean, they're truly horrific. And just today, we are seeing the last couple of hours, the pictures of one of the largest printing warehouses and facilities in Europe has been destroyed with an unknown quantity of books and printed materials. But we know this facility produces 1/3 of all the printed material in Ukraine. There's a direct attack on culture. It is absolutely comparable to what the Nazis would have done in terms of, book burning and that kind of stuff. If I can throw a little political grenade in here, what would happen if Ukraine was to ignore the request, which actually is not a public one, but it is assumed to be behind the scenes? What if they were to ignore that and strike these troops in Kharkiv on the Russian side of the border in Kharkiv with US-made weapons? Apart from Jake Sullivan running around playing whack-a-mole, what would be the consequences of doing that?
Well, one of the consequences we're seeing right now, just on this discussion, is you have a fundamental disagreement within the Biden administration on this. You have today the Secretary of State saying that we should ease the prohibition. Now, I don't know what ease means. It's like being pregnant. You either are or you aren't, right? So if you're going to fire weapons across the border, maybe his perspective of ease is hit military targets, not necessarily strike deep into Ukraine to hit out factories or something. I'm not sure what ease means, but there is a divide that's growing within within the administration. Again, Jake Sullivan and even Secretary of Defense and our Chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff have said that that's not our policy. And even within the State Department, the State Department or the spokesman for the State Department has said what the Pentagon. So you're starting to see that divide. But a great question: what would happen if they chose to use those weapons without the approval? I don't know, but I do know through other discussions, and I think there's been leaked information coming out of Ukraine that there was a statement at least warning Ukraine not to do that, and if they did it, that the United States would pull the weapons from them. Now, I don't know the accuracy of that statement, but I do know that it was leaked from Ukrainian media. Sometimes that's meant to influence. I got it, but I suspect the hardliners that don't want this to occur, if they use those weapons, would go at the president and say, we can't let this happen, and they would stop the shipment, unfortunately.
But this would give a great political ammunition to, I guess, what you'd characterize as the more sort of Reaganite Republicans, or those who are now aligning with Speaker Johnson, who's got more hawkish on this subject. That would give tremendous ammunition to the Democrats' opponents.
Yeah, right. It certainly complicates matters.
Right. Jonathan, you're right. I know Speaker Johnson came out saying basically, without saying it, but he's fine if Ukraine does that. And I think, at this point, we just may be faced with Ukraine having to do that, lacking any other options. Now, that said, it's easier for John and me to sit here and say, hey, be bold, try it. But unfortunately, with this administration, and again, John and I are not political, not attacking Democrats or Republicans here. I just don't look through war in those lenses. But, they may look to, and not to get down a rabbit hole with Israel and Gaza, but they may look to what's been happening with the Biden administration to, reprimanding Benjamin Netanyahu and withholding certain ammunitions and going, okay, what if that happens to us? We've seen what it's been like for the 6 months where we've had deprivations of munitions and what that's done to us on the battlefield. Can we even risk going there? So I think it's a great question. I think it certainly would be a bold move. And personally, I would advise it if they can't get the U.S. to come around. But there is a tremendous risk there. And I do fear, unfortunately, that more than Blinken, I think it's Jake Sullivan who's holding sway, and they'll be punished for it. And that's just crazy. It just plays to Putin's favor.
And they have already tried this a little bit, haven't they? Because we don't know this as an absolute fact, although various statements were made afterwards. When Ukraine was hitting the Russian oil refinery capacity, in this instance, it's with their own weaponry. It's not with US weaponry. It did seem that Sullivan flew to Kyiv specifically to put pressure to say, you've got to stop doing this. But they carried on. So in that instance, it's their weaponry, their control. And of course, it'd be interesting to hear what you think as an economist there, the strategic importance of continuing to hit Russian refinery capacity, because even this week they've hit Novorossiysk port heavily, and they continue to hit oil storage and refining capacity. Not the pipelines yet, but that's a potential target. So they've already tried to push the envelope a little bit. And what would it have been like to be a fly on the wall on that conversation and hearing the kind of pressure that in this instance was placed but didn't work?
Yeah, Jonathan, it's a fair point. Strategic, hitting oil refineries, production points, pipelines, those are all legitimate military targets. My great uncle flew 37 missions from England, and a B-17 is the bombardier. Attempting to do just that, across many targets in Romania at the time. And certainly Ukraine needs to be doing that. I think what you're seeing here, and so to answer your question about how an economist would look like it, it's critical. But I think John would also point out to you in a second here, but it's also important and essential from a military standpoint. But I think what we're seeing here in big picture, and it's unfortunate, but what you're seeing is November politics. It's about the presidential election, not wanting to run up gas prices. And that's unfortunate because it's just crazy. You don't manage a war based on electoral calculus, in my opinion. And so I find it outrageous. Ukraine is not doing anything different than we did in World War II, and anything different than we would do if we were fighting this battle ourselves. That John can speak better, to the military implications of denying Russia those oil supplies, or more importantly, the refined gas.
Yeah, Jonathan, I think what you said is a great point, and the reaction by Jake Sullivan in the United States, particularly the State Department, also weighed in on this too, is a great point also. And from my position, and I think Mark agrees, it showcased the U.S. interest more than it showcased the Ukrainian interest. Okay, more concerned about the outcome of what could happen to the price of oil, or the outcome that could happen to the price of liquid natural gas, or the possibility of any type of retaliation by Russia and what they would do. So that's one thing. The other thing is, I'd say let's on the subject, let's talk about the introduction of HIMARS. When HIMARS was first introduced to the battlefield in May and June of last year, the effectiveness that it had within Russia, or not within Russia, but within Ukraine on the battlefield, it turned momentum. It pushed Russians out. It drove them away from Kiev, and they actually regained a majority of the terrain that they'd lost, directly associated with HIMARS being introduced. Let's look at what ATACMS is doing right now in Crimea. The strikes that they're doing on airfields, the strikes that they've done against Russian naval forces. It's a very capable weapon system, and one, quite frankly, that the United States knows could do that type of damage to Russia along the border area, and they're afraid of it. And let's talk about Russia second, third order effects. What we've seen in the past week or indications of how Russia may respond. We've seen Russia declaring new maritime borders in the Baltic Sea. We're seeing the launch of an anti-satellite into orbit. We're seeing tactical nuclear weapon drills. We're starting to see an upward tick in sabotage operations in Western Europe, particularly Germany and Poland. And we've also seen, from a U.S. policy perspective, Russian forces move into an abandoned air base in Niger. So all this plays into this huge informational war that we're seeing into Russia right now.
And you've also written compellingly, and I think this is interesting because if you look at this election calculus, it almost relegates the Ukraine war to a regional conflict, a regional problem. And yet, a lot of what you've been writing about, a lot of what you have both been saying, is that this could be, 1937, 1938. There are numerous conflagrations, and we are failing to see the connections between them and failing to see how they could merge into World War III. If that is the case, it really demands a lot more connected and strategic thinking on our part. And I guess it requires a Cold War mentality, a sort of domino mentality, where you don't let something like Niger or individual losses happen. You fight every single battle, every single struggle to provide, to prevent it going further. But we don't seem to have that mindset.
Yeah, let me take that. Recently, John and I wrote an article for The Hill entitled "Biden is Losing World War III," and we didn't come to that title lightly, or that headline, because certainly we know when we write something like that, and sure enough, it has. I Googled John and my names in Russian last night, and they're loving that headline. So we knew that was going to play, and it would be used and exploited for propaganda purposes. But there does come a point where, if the administration is not willing to connect the dots, we need to, because while we've gone back, and I'm losing this now, but I think at least 2 years ago, John and I argued that we're in this dystopian third world war. It doesn't look like what Hollywood said it was going to look like, right? We don't see doomsday scenarios. We don't see mushroom clouds, on the horizons, that kind of thing. It's a very different kind of World War III, but it is World War III. And we're losing it. And we're losing it because we can't see the bigger picture. Ukraine is an important part of that. But if we don't step back and we don't start seeing how all these pieces fit together, Taiwan, Ukraine, the Middle East, how this coalition is developing and coalescing at the same time between Tehran, Pyongyang, as well as, Beijing and Moscow, we're going to get caught short. And they sense that. I really do believe what we're seeing now on a global basis is our foes, including that of Great Britain's and the United Kingdom, I should say, broader for your audience, they sense blood in the water. And so that's why you're seeing today, as we talk, China is surrounding Taiwan, basically showing us how they would cut them off and isolate the island. So I think our duty in terms of sounding the alarm here is to say we can no longer just look at this as Ukraine or Israel in separate pieces. We've got to like zoom out to a much higher level and realize that our enemies think we're not going to respond to it. They can perpetrate World War III against us, but we're going to maintain this isolationist approach almost, that nothing really big or bad is happening on a global scale. And it's just wrong. I mean, it's madness. We're not going on a war footing. You don't see any massive increases in terms of spending at a level required to fight not just 1.5 wars, which we point out, that's all we're geared towards. That's all the national security strategy of the United States is geared toward. It's essentially fighting 1.5 wars, but there's 3.5 out there. There's Ukraine, there's China, there's the Middle East, and as John pointed out, because I only had 3 when I first wrote that piece, John is saying you can't forget the Sahel and what Russia is doing, across sub-Saharan Africa, and one could argue we're seeing the nations start in South and Central America as well, in Guyana.
That's the interesting point, isn't it? When it comes to escalation, the policy that is very much associated with Jake Sullivan is called escalation management. And yet you see Russia, Putin, escalating at every opportunity and seeking to open new fronts wherever he can. You could, with some justification, see Georgia as a new front, because we've done a number of episodes on the channel on what's happening in Tbilisi, and many of the commentators there think it's very unlikely that the Georgian Dream would have reintroduced the foreign agent policy and tried to bring things to a head at this point. They were heading for an electoral victory. So why create all this turbulence? Why create all this friction at this point? It seems to have the fingerprints of the Kremlin all over it. When you look at the foreign agents law and you look at the sort of sliding scale of autocracy with Serbia, Slovakia, and many other territories that are on some kind of scale towards autocracy and cancellation of, the sort of pluralistic values that we're championing here, you see it almost as a toolkit for autocrats. And Russia is the primary exporter of that expertise and that political technology.
Absolutely. And you left out Kosovo and ethnic tensions that that have been generated through the Serbs, but the Serbs are allies, obviously have deep affiliations with Russia. You left out Sudan, the Wagner mercenaries in Sudan helping to topple that government, but not necessarily for the government, but for the gold, right? They're pulling gold out of the country. We've talked about a number of undersea coax pipelines have been sabotaged, gas lines have been sabotaged. So yeah, it's oh, and let's not forget Moldova, right? There's been a lot of influence within Moldova to cause political tensions there, and then flyovers of Romania with Russian missiles, and in some cases impacting in Romania. So this is all about generating as much noise as they can so you don't pay attention to the signal, which is a failure right now in Ukraine. The opportunity, and I've spoken about this with Mark a number of times, and we write about it, but I can't help but think that if you remove Russia from the equation, all these other issues go away, or at least at some level they go away, because the funding's not there, the political influence isn't there. And how do you make Russia go away is by defeating them in Ukraine, because I think Russia will take care of its own. If there's a defeat in Ukraine and they lose Crimea, it will self-correct itself.
I agree. I really don't have anything to add to that. I think it's, it's just a question of recognizing that we can't continue to step back. I will add something. I think, in terms of that escalation, John and I are from a different generation. My father was a World War II vet, fighter pilot in the Pacific. John's was in Vietnam. I've known John for 50 plus years. So, I knew his father well as well. And, we were taught, look, you try to talk it out with a bully, but if you can't, at some point you got to fight back. And there's some points in time that a bully's only going to stand getting hit in the mouth. And basically that's where we're at with Putin. And, granted, that's not woke. That's not what modern generation thinks. It's certainly not what teachers would advise kids to be doing, on the playground. But, we're in adult life, we're in real life. And it's time, this escalation game has to stop. Biden so fears escalation that he's actually leading to it because Putin's back there going, any threat of escalation works. I get more and more of what I want. So why wouldn't I do more? It's just time to hit him back. And in my mind, to keep putting an exclamation mark on what we were calling for today in the Hill, the best way to do that is a no-fly zone in Ukraine. That would be a first, like, wake-up call to Putin to say, you've gone too far. Now you're going to have, U.S. at least, if not NATO, air forces to contend with in terms of protecting the cities in Ukraine.
You've reminded me of the words of my Irish grandmother when I was at school on how to deal with bullies, and it was thump them in the mouth. Those are exact words there. And I know if she was alive, what she'd be saying about Putin now, something very much in that vein.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, one of the comments that's been made by several general officers, retired general officers, that is it's one thing again to say it, but we don't have, we, the United States and NATO, don't have to strike Russia. But what we do need to do is come out publicly and say, we are supporting Ukraine. We support Ukraine to win the war, and winning the war is defined as Russia being out of the country. And we are prepared to give Ukraine ATACMS, F-16s, and what other weapon systems they need to do the job until it is complete. Right now, the wording that they're using is like splitting hairs. It's like if something goes right, we can say we did it. If something goes wrong, we can say we didn't do it. We got to get on board, right? And right now, we're not on board. We're splitting hairs. They need to send a message right to Putin, on a national spotlight. This is what's going to happen, and this is what we're going to do to support that. So, and right now, we're just not there. And I'm not sure we're going to get there based upon what we've been seeing in Washington for the past week.
Is this a lack of leadership, essentially? Because I've been hearing certain complaints actually in Ukraine about politicians as well, which is that inaction means that terrible things might happen, but your name isn't associated with it. Whereas as soon as you put your name to something, it might go right, it might go wrong. If it goes wrong, you're going to lose your job, your reputation. So what we're seeing here is a complete lack of leadership, a lack of doing the right thing. Is this perhaps a commonality that we may have with some Western politicians, but also with potentially some Ukrainian ones as well?
Yeah, I think what we're looking at here in broader picture is there may be a lot of good intention, but in reality, in terms of what's reaching the battlefield, it's not working. And, I was reminded, I grabbed this book. I don't know if you can see it, but I remember this from my childhood reading Things Fall Apart. It's a novel. I'll butcher his name. Chinua Achebe wrote it, about how there was a lot of good intention in Africa, in this country, this fictional country, of solving the slave trade and stopping it. And in the end, he gives up. He can't fight. He doesn't win that fight. And I think that's where we're at right now. Things are falling apart because we lack vision. In this administration, and again, not criticizing Biden because he's a Democrat, not taking a Democrat versus Republican thing. He doesn't have the vision to see this through to victory, not only in Ukraine, but on a global basis. I don't think he can comprehend just the scale at which the threat is that we're facing. And not just our country, but any member state in the Western world. And so until we realize that things are falling apart, until we realize that it's going to take U.S. leadership to get us on a right course, I think we're headed for disaster, and not one that is going to be easily recovered from. I think we'll survive. I'm not talking about the world evolving into nuclear war, but I think you could see massive setbacks, which ultimately could lead to huge economic decline. I mean, the U.S. and its allies have to realize it's World War III, and I don't say that in terms of bombs and the like, but it's World War III on a lot of levels. It's sabotage, it's economic warfare, it's kinetic as well. What we're seeing in the Mideast and Ukraine and the like. We got to get in the fight. I mean, we're just sitting on the sidelines. And a story that John and I have not yet gotten to that we wanted to write is basically saying Foggy Bottom, State Department, your foreign office as well, needs to wake up and realize the old global order ended on February 22nd, 2022. They keep acting as though we can go back to negotiations, that we can figure out a solution that's diplomatic and, or, Putin and Xi aren't playing by those rules anymore. And yet we're kind of like the Who's in Whoville and the, How the Grinch Stole Christmas, where they're just marching along, but they don't get it. The other side isn't listening. It doesn't want to listen. And so it's just going to take some realism coming back into our leadership. And I just don't see that happening right now. I mean, we really are in a tough spot. And your country's facing elections now, come June, right? And I think that should
July the
be
4th, I think it is, isn't
July
it?
4th, July 4th,
But it's very, very
right?
close. Yeah.
Right. Your queen's birthday, if I recollect correctly. So I hope that takes center stage, because that really needs to be the debate. Whoever wins that election, it really needs to be the debate is whether or not we recognize that there's a bigger conflict going on above and beyond just Ukraine.
Yeah, the one of the quotes that's thrown around a lot in Washington, D.C. is being on the right side of history. You hear that a lot. And but being on the right side of history requires a decision. Okay, requires a decision, a commitment to win. Not a commitment just to keep giving weapons to somebody and hoping it works itself out, that hoping that they come to the conclusion on their own that all they're going to do is continue attriting one another. That's not a decision. Okay, a non-decision, by the way, is a decision. It's a decision not to do the right thing. And we're finding ourselves on the wrong side of history when we look back one day and say what we could have done to prevent this, what we could have done to win this, what we could have done to save more Ukrainian lives. And right now we're not there. We're at a point of let's just watch and see and wait to see what happens. And we'll give you some. Mark and I call that strategy just enough. Look, just enough isn't working. Okay, defense is not working. I can hear Patton now saying attack, attack, attack. And we don't have that mentality anymore. Somewhere along the way, we'd lost that. And we need to regain that mentality. Ukraine certainly has that mentality, but they're being held back. We need the mentality of the offense. And right now it's lacking, and we certainly need a Patton right now.
And
This
let me
morning,
quickly,
sorry, yeah,
if I
jump in,
can,
Mark.
yeah, if I can quickly add, I think too that the West has got to get out of this mentality that it takes a 9/11, a Pearl Harbor, those kind of surprises, what the British did at Toronto in World War II in terms of the swordfishes taking out the Italian fleet. We think in terms of surprises. And I think that kind of left hook could be coming. I mean, we keep taking for granted that these drills that China is doing around Taipei are simply drills. But one of these days, if we get lulled into enough of these, one of those drills may not be a drill. And then we're suddenly faced with a very real kinetic situation in the Pacific to add to it. So we just all need to wake up. I mean, the time has come to recognize this conflict for what it is. It's global and it's real.
The last question very much sort of launches from that. Now, Russia has not proven itself to be particularly sophisticated on the battlefield. As you mentioned earlier, its capacity really, in terms of sophistication, is to flatten everything, overwhelm, and they use extreme brutality, torture, threats, etc. That unfortunately works. They controlled a big chunk of Europe for 70 years on that basis. Something which I think a lot of people seem to forget. But they are exceptionally good at lying. They are exceptionally good at subterfuge, and at what has been termed coercive control. Are we becoming a little more aware of how this works? I mean, if you're in the pro-Ukrainian bubble, there will be names like Sullivan, Samuel Charap that come up an awful lot. But how do we map these networks where Russia uses coercive control, where it uses the threat of nuclear weapons to get the West to hold back from helping Ukraine? How can we map these networks and dismantle them?
It's a great question, and one in which I think the West is aware of what's going on, but the West doesn't have a counter. I mean, you have to counter it. I don't see, and that's one of my frustrations. I just don't see a counter narrative. I don't see the counter narrative in Ukraine. I don't see the counter narrative in the Middle East. I don't see the counter narrative in Asia. I just don't see it. I see it more of a well, that's not really happening. That's not really, but we don't fight back. We don't push back. So I think by not pushing back, people start to accept it. And the other thing is repetition. they keep saying it, they keep saying it, they keep saying it, and eventually we stop fighting it, and it just becomes the narrative. I think the Germans are very good at that in the Second World War, just simply repeating the message over and over and over and over and over until it sunk in. And until we push back, until we have an information war, an information campaign, we're susceptible to it. And the other thing is people just don't want it to be. Oh, we don't want that. That's too hard. As we say in the Army, we put that in the too hard to do box. We'll put it over here. Let someone else address it. And that's what's frustrating. It's where is the intestinal fortitude? Where has it gone? And I would love to see some of it come back. And where is it coming from? We're seeing bits and pieces of it starting to assemble itself, but will it arrive on time? Mark?
Yeah, no, I concur. And if I find it interesting because if you look back in parallels of history, you know, everyone was worried about fifth columnists, right? Fifth columnists were going to do this, that, you know, in Britain and in France and then the like. Well, really now we are faced with a fifth columnist group, but it's coming in the form of bots online. It's, you know, I'm sure, Jonathan, you get those. John and I certainly do, where, you know, you post something on Twitter, the next thing you know, we're getting 20 automated replies from, you know, 20 different accounts, but with the same message. You've got this army, but a lot of these, you know, some of them are obvious and overt in that way, but others are trying to, and have clearly been designed to mimic UK or US citizens. And they're trying to appear like they're normal Joe Schmo guys. And you see patterns like we're into sports or something. But their page says they're all into sports, but when you look at their posts, it's all about, you know, anti-Ukraine and, you know, how they're Nazis and all of that kind of stuff. So I think and John knows this better than I do because he stood up a cyber command in the Army, is we really do have to confront this at a technological level to put a stop to these bots because they are shaping the conversation in two ways, simply by flooding the zone. It's all out there. But right now, and again, I'm always a little hesitant to overgeneralize, but right now we're in a validation era. People want their own viewpoints to be validated. So when they go out there and they see Joe Schmo, who they think is real, validating their point of view, and usually it's with a political dig, you know, Biden's doing this wrong or whatever, Trump's doing this right, they fall for it. But what they don't realize is that they've just bought hook, line, and sinker the Russian propaganda that's come along with it. And just recently, I know there's been even more reporting, and John and I have warned about this before in other articles, you know, even with the cancer announcement of the Princess of Wales, Catherine, there's a ton of Chinese disinformation campaign designed to kind of undermine, mock her, et cetera, to keep that story exploding. So it's very real, and it's something that we've got to address. And that fifth columnist has become a new army. It's you know, before it was something, you know, I don't want to say imaginary, but it was marginal. Now it's significant, and it has an impact on public opinion, and that's got to be mitigated.
And there are real people as well, aren't there? There are real assets and agents who, whether consciously or unconsciously, will amplify and repeat Russian narratives. The best of them, the most subtle ones, will reframe it sometimes into, you know, statements of sort of geopolitical theory. They'll put it in certain clothes that make it attractive for the left, the right, the center. Those are the ones that we don't see coming, though, aren't we? These are the more subtle networks of influence, which can be extremely corrosive, but which we've barely uncovered.
Well, let me add real quick before John gets to that. You know, John and I spent a day with a cybersecurity firm based in Africa, and we watched in real time how that disinformation works. And, you know, one example was a Facebook video. It seems innocuous enough, but it was basically one glorifying Wagner Group activities inside of Africa. That gets spread by live bodies in Nigeria. They're paid. Post this online, start sharing those things online, just like an economic scam or something that you might see. And then what happens with that is it starts getting shared across social media. And if someone wants to fact check it, China and Russia have both set up fake fact check sites. So people, you know, in Africa, and in all of this, in this particular case, we were researching how the Commonwealth nations were being targeted with anti-UK propaganda. All of this gets, you know, said, yep, no, that's true on these fact check sites. And then you got Chinese Star Media from beaming satellite down into villages across Africa, reporting this as news. So at all levels, people are being inundated with this. So, and I'm going to kick it over to John, but just want to let you know we had, it's frightening because it goes, one little thing, and John watched it and I watched it. You see the dots, they just like, we could go right to the address that did it on a screen, and then boom, here's the address that starts it. And then a map just lights up the world as that disinformation spreads in real time.
Yeah, Jonathan, it's deliberate, and it's a process. It's a rehearsed process. It's a coordinated process. And the only way to defeat that is, unfortunately, for the generation that's come up over the last 20 or 30 years, is critical thinking skills. And quite frankly, I think we lack critical thinking, the ability to look at something and to challenge it and say that doesn't look right. We live in a world of social media where immediate gratification, and you're out there getting information from unverified sources, but you have to process that information. You have to apply some thought to it, critical thinking. You got to take out your filters of politicalization or gentrification. I mean, whatever. You got to get rid of that, and you got to apply critical thinking. And we're not teaching people critical. We're not teaching average civilians critical thinking. There's critical thinking is being taught within the military, within the cyber world, within the signals intelligence world, and amongst our analysts. But I don't think we're seeing critical thinking skills applied to the average person who's on social media, getting their news from social media. And of course, that's a big thing too. Most people are turning off the television and going to social media for their news. And I don't know how you police that up without violating, amendment rights, First Amendment rights. I don't know how you do that. They're working on it. I got it, but the speed at which they're working on it isn't going as fast as the speed of the information is getting out on social media. So it's critical thinking skills is right now is part of the solution.
And we should look to Ukraine because, they've been at the front line of the informational as well as the physical war. We've done lots of interviews with Ukrainians innovating technology and techniques, and as you say, critical media literacy skills, and having a fair degree of success actually with it. The other aspect is taking oligarchs out of media, which is an interesting thing, which that would be a painful step for most Western countries to take. But these are themes which I'd love to pursue in future conversations. We're out of time in this one. It's been absolutely thrilling to speak to both of you. We're going to put links to your recent articles that have been referenced in this conversation into the description of the video. I strongly suggest people check those out because, as you say, they're not partisan and they're extremely realistic in what needs to happen vis-a-vis Ukraine and victory. But again, thank you so much for everything you do, and thank you for coming on the channel.
Hey, thanks for having us back on. Great opportunity.
Pleasure, Jonathan. Thank you.